The massive oak doors to the prince's chamber burst, open not with ceremony but with force. It wasn't a servant nor a courtier, but King Philip II himself, armored like he was marching into battle. His visor reflected the torchlight, but his expression behind it remained unreadable. He wasn't a father that night. He was a sovereign about to detain his own flesh and blood. I'm your host, Cloak Testament, and this is the Timeworn record, where we deep dive into history's most intriguing stories, unveiling the mysteries and truth that lie below, possibly forgotten. Prince Don Carlos sat upright in bed, dazed and breathless, as armed guards spilled into his room. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. And then he understood. This wasn't a reprimand. It was a reckoning. His father hadn't come to argue or console. He had come to end this chapter himself. That haunting moment would reverberate across Europe. But how did Spain's heir become its greatest liability? To trace the roots of this royal implosion, we must go back not to the betrayal, but to the birth. Because from his first breath, Carlos's destiny was already a tragedy written in blood. In 1545, the Spanish court celebrated the arrival of an heir. Bells rang, nobles wept with joy, and letters of congratulations poured in from every corner of Europe. But behind the gilded doors, the palace physicians were less jubilant. They had seen what the public had not, the peril etched into the boy's lineage. Carlos wasn't born of strangers. He was the product of generations of royal inbreeding. His parents, Philip II and Maria Manuela of Portugal, were first cousins. Their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters. That's not a metaphor, it's a genealogical nightmare. Of the 16 great-great-grandparents most people have, Carlos had only 6. The Habsburg obsession with keeping bloodlines pure had twisted his family tree into a spiral. When Carlos entered the world on July 8, 1545, something was already wrong. His skull bulged asymmetrically, his cries were feeble, and his limbs seemed off-kilter. But he was male and alive and in royal Spain. That was enough to justify celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela, was less fortunate. The childbirth had wrecked her body. She held her son once, then fever took her within days. The bells that rang for Carlos's birth tolled again for his mother's funeral. Philip, just 20, stood at the head of the mourners, holding a son who had cost him his wife. He'd gained an heir, but lost the only woman who might have softened the sharpness of the throne. Even in infancy, Carlos defied expectations. He screamed for hours without cause, then fell into eerie silences that unsettled his nurses. One maid claimed he stopped breathing altogether for nearly a minute. Before gasping back to life, the doctors reassured Philip infants are fragile, unpredictable. But none dared say what they truly feared: this boy was not normal. The Habsburg jaw, that signature protruding chin, so famous in royal portraits, was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the skin, Carlos's very DNA was a chaotic puzzle, pieced together from too few ancestors. By age 12, the effects of that gene pool were impossible to ignore. His torso was warped, his left leg shorter than the right, and his ribcage compressed his lungs so that every breath was shallow. When the royal armorer tried to fit him for armor, nothing fit, not because of craftsmanship, but because Carlos's body followed no symmetry. His head bulged unnaturally on one side. His gait dragged across the marble floors, with a scrape and clunk that echoed down corridors. The court painters adapted portraying him only in profile, using tricks of lighting and pose. But no brush could erase what was right in front of the nobles. The heir to the Spanish throne was visibly damaged. And worse, his mind followed suit. Carlos was unpredictable. Some days he spoke with charm and wit, quoting Latin philosophers. Other days he barely formed sentences, speaking in fragmented thoughts and angry mutterings. He developed obsessions, counting patterns, odd rituals, and migraines so severe he banged his head against the walls, leaving smears of blood on the stone. But the worst signs weren't physical, they were moral. One day, a royal shoemaker presented a custom-made pair of boots. The left one was slightly tight. Carlos's response: He ordered the man to eat them. Not metaphorically, literally. The man had to slice the boots apart and chew through leather as the prince watched, smiling. This was no childish tantrum. It was a glimpse into something darker. Carlos didn't just lash out, he enjoyed it. He roasted live rabbits in his chambers, timing their screams. Servants found their scorched remains arranged in geometric patterns. A page boy who laughed at Carlos's limp awoke to find him looming overhead with a fire poker. He would have struck had he not lost balance and fallen. Still, the court endured. Philip kept hoping his son would grow out of it. But he hadn't anticipated a political twist that would inflame Carlos's unstable mind marriage. Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess, had been promised to Carlos. He studied her portrait endlessly. For the first time, he imagined a life beyond deformity, a wife, a partner. But then came the betrayal. Philip, a widower, needed a new queen. And so, in a move that stunned Europe, he married Elizabeth himself. Carlos was forced to attend the wedding. He watched his father take vows with the woman who'd been promised to him. It shattered him. Elizabeth, out of pity or perhaps politics, remained kind to Carlos. She called him cousin, smiled politely, but every kind word cut deeper. He began stalking her, leaving grotesque gifts, dead birds, locks of his own hair, defaced portraits. At a masquerade, he whispered something in her ear that made her blanch and flee. From then on, she was never left alone with him again. Carlos's obsession metastasized into rage. He blamed Philip for everything: his deformities, his stolen bride, his future. He began keeping lists of enemies. He asked ambassadors how kings could be overthrown. He hinted at rebellion, and then came the fall. In 1562, he chased a maid down a narrow staircase after she saw his bare, twisted foot. He tripped. His skull cracked against the stone. For 3 days, he lay unconscious. When he awoke, something was different. Trepanning was attempted drilling into his skull to release pressure. During the procedure, he woke. He didn't scream. He stared blankly at the ceiling while the drill bit into his skull. Afterwards, Carlos seemed revived, but worse. His paranoia deepened. He accused servants of poisoning him. He hoarded weapons. He even tried to bribe guards for escape routes. Then came word he planned to flee to the Netherlands, where rebellion against Spanish rule was growing. He would declare himself liberator, opposing Philip, uniting Spain's enemies under his banner. One of his trusted confidants was a spy. Within hours, Philip knew everything. And so on January 18th, 1568, the king donned his armor not for war, but for an arrest. He entered Carlos's room, flanked by guards. The prince offered no resistance. Perhaps he understood. Carlos was locked in a tower room, technically a royal chamber, but unmistakably a prison. Over the next 6 months, he deteriorated rapidly. He refused to eat. He soiled himself. He stopped recognizing people. His obsession with ice became pathological. He poured buckets of it over his head to cool the madness. He would scream at invisible advisors, conduct imaginary council meetings, even argue with his dead mother in fluent Portuguese, a language he'd never been taught. On July 24th, 1568, he was found unconscious, drenched in ice water. His final words, spoken with eerie clarity, were, "Tell my father I forgive him." Hours later, Don Carlos died. He was 23. The official record blamed natural illness, but within days, all portraits were removed. Letters were burned. The room sealed. Carlos wasn't just dead, he was being erased. Philip ensured no grand funeral took place. No monument, just a name, a date, nothing more. But erasing memory is harder than erasing men. In time, artists and enemies reclaimed the story. German playwright Friedrich Schiller reimagined Carlos not as a broken tyrant, but as a tragic idealist. Giuseppe Verdi turned that myth into opera, a noble, misunderstood prince crushed by tyranny. Audiences wept, but they wept for a fiction. The real Don Carlos, malformed in body, cruel in spirit, undone by his own blood, was buried in silence. And in that silence, perhaps, lies the most haunting truth of all.